Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
The federal government is poised to see some of the biggest spending cuts since the 1990s, at least in certain departments and programs. Federal Finance Minister Francois-Phillippe Champagne has been given the somewhat unenviable task of finding an estimated $25 billion in savings from the federal budget to offset what is expected to be the biggest increase in defense spending in a generation. And Prime Minister Mark Carney's push to build the Canadian economy with big-ticket infrastructure initiatives and housing development. Welcome to The Big Story. This is a special crossover edition with In This Economy, where today we're going to be looking at the implications for what is expected to be a massive change, a shift in the direction from the Trudeau era, where the number of government employees rose by 30% to now over 400,000 workers, to a more streamlined civil service, which has the unions representing workers worried about mass layoffs. The Globe and Mail reported this week that Finance Minister Champagne was tasking his cabinet counterparts with finding department savings of 7.5% for next year, rising to 15% by 2028. Now, if those targets were met, it would be about $25 billion in annual savings. But even with that, the federal deficit is still just a best guess at this point, expected to climb to above $80 billion this year, according to recent analysis by the C.D. Howe Institute. So joining me to talk about all of these challenges and the likely pushback from certain government departments that these changes might lead to is Dr. Wayne Petrozzi, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Toronto Metropolitan University. Thank you very much for joining me, Professor.
Oh, you're welcome.
The Carney government has been criticized in its early days for not presenting any even framework of a federal budget. If they're talking about this kind of change from spending and savings, is it any surprise, really, that they don't exactly know how this is all going to frame up yet?
I think certainly it explains that, in a sense, they have to prepare the runway for this, what is turning out to be a 3-year process of, as they call it, right-sizing the federal government, both on the staff side as well as on the financial side. So I'm not surprised they need that time before they release their first budget in the fall, because that budget's going to essentially establish, if you like, a ground zero against which the cuts you mentioned are going to be put into place.
Well, look, this is kind of turning, though, the government on its head. Even though it's still a liberal government, it is a very different mandate for the new prime minister and his cabinet. You can argue that he's been pressured into this idea of increasing the defense budget, but the reality is they're going to do it, and it's going to be by the billions of dollars, maybe $9 billion as much already this year alone, before we even get into the savings initiatives. So, under that circumstance, how this, when we're talking about, changes not seen since the 1990s, again, back then it was under very different circumstance, there could be a very different look to how this government is operated in the not too distant future.
That's certainly the case. It's interesting. You mentioned the 90s period, and that was, of course, a period of dramatic budget cuts and staff reductions that were initiated also by a liberal government. In this case, the duo was Martin and Chrétien.
Yep.
And I think part of what we need to keep in mind is that it seems liberals are better able to manage these sorts of large cuts because of their, if you like, how they're perceived by the public, at least a segment of the public, than, say, conservatives might be. And I think that he understands that. I think the big change really is in the 90s, they dressed it all up in fancy consultant language about restructuring, reorganizing, and they had these acronyms that they threw around like paper dolls. This time, there's no need for that. I think doesn't suit Carney's temperament. He's out of the private sector world, or certainly been in it a long time, so he understands he doesn't need that, and to dress it up that way in order to make it presentable to a skeptical public or academic community. he's going to go ahead and make changes on a similarly large scale. I mean, the numbers you mentioned are large, including, the staff reductions, which will be significant. It's ironic when you think the growth that you mentioned in the civil service in the last 10 years or so, it's also partnered with the largest increase in spending on consultants. So it's not as if we were hiring people so we didn't need more consultants. No, we were hiring people and using more consultants at the same time. So I think he's going to do a reset. It's going to take time. That's why they've used a 3-year timeline to see these changes through.
Well, thinking back to the 1990s, and the Canadian dollar at that point was, down around 60 cents. So there was this feeling of the necessity of making change, and that was, bought in by the voting public at the time. And could you make the argument that right now we've got a similar amount of support from the voters? They reelected a liberal government, albeit on a minority standpoint. There has been discussions about the so-called bloated civil service rather, and the fact that defense spending and, look, it's going to cost money to build pipelines. It's going to cost money to build housing, that there is this public push for change, that they will have fairly solid support for this.
I think that's the case. I mean, again, if you keep in mind the early 90s, the situation Canada was in was presented almost as an existential crisis. Wall Street Journal was talking about us falling into third world status, a debt trap, and et cetera, et cetera. And so people were, there was a great deal of anxiety. I think much of that back then was cooked and was to suit a narrative. I think today, though, the situation does put us in a near existential situation. It's the reconstruction and tearing down simultaneously of our foreign relations. America is no longer going to be what America has been for all of our lives, and we're going to have to take that apart and at the same time lay the groundwork for a different set of relationships, economically, culturally, politically, with other countries, primarily the EU and some major states out in Asia.
Well, to some extent, I mean, it has been sold as an existential crisis, this trade war with the U.S., right? So,
absolutely, it has. And we don't know yet the depth of it because we have a negotiating partner that they portray themselves at that simply acts as a whim and is a bully.
do you also think about the fact that Mark Carney, the structure of his government? I mean, he's got Michael Sabia as one of his top advisors out of Quebec, a gentleman with a long-term track record as a CEO of some of Canada's biggest companies and pension connections. From that, running a government as a business, and Carney's own background coming from the real estate and of course after his terms at the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, is that a different leadership structure that can also exact the kind of change that they're looking to do?
I think that's true, but I wouldn't quite frame it the same way. You see, I think the bringing in people from outside is more concerned with traditionally civil servants can tend to be rather process oriented. And sometimes process is played out to the detriment of outcomes. He's bringing in people who are not so enthralled by the right process, but are very much taken with the right outcome. So I think that's what motivating some of his personnel choices at the very highest levels. He wants folks that are going to focus on getting those things done, as opposed to whether or not they followed the exact protocols and processes to enable them to get to someplace.
Mark Carney's also talked about the idea of explaining the federal budget in a different format, kind of splitting it in two, where you've got your long-term big ticket items in one column and then your day-to-day running of the government in another. Do you think there's wisdom to that, to kind of give a clearer indication, again, back to the voter, and the taxpayer exactly how the money's being spent?
I think it will help in terms of clarity. I think for most of us, even in terms of our own households, we distinguish between what we spend on, going to a show or going for dinner versus what we're paying for our homes. We understand they're different. Add that the one is much more long term, but it's also about concerns assets don't completely disappear once consumed in the way that I went to the show last night. Once I left that theater, it was gone. It was consumed. There was nothing there except my memories of the movie. And so doing that with government spending, separating the operating costs from, if you like, the capital investments and capital costs, if it clarifies things better for people, I don't see that as a problem. But it's no fantastic new innovation in financial management, that's for sure.
I'm wondering if the estimates that are put out by, I mentioned off the top about the CD Howe Institute, their shadow budget, so to speak. They're talking about a budgetary deficit that could be north of $92 billion this year, which would be double than I think what the fall fiscal was last year. Of course, a lot has changed since. But when and if that transpires that it's that big, does that again ramp up the talk that this government needs to cut spending, basically accentuating the narrative or defending the narrative that big change is needed going forward?
One, I'm not sure that he will necessarily fall back to that defensive position at first pushback, because the truth is, as CD Howe doesn't like to talk about it, uh, our debt relative to other countries is we're in much better shape. So, but and that you could, whether you look at the Americans, whether you look at the Japanese, the Italians, the Germans, the French, et cetera, et cetera. So our debt situation nationally isn't as dire as that year that this will look like going forward that we're going to receive when we see the deficit for the year is going to give the implicates that, oh my, we're heading towards a cliff. We're not heading towards a cliff. Now if he gets pushed hard enough in terms of trying to defend this, he may very well revert to that, making that kind of defensive of his policies and his government.
Much of a challenge, though, getting back to the finance minister. I mean, he's sending out these letters and demanding these cuts. He's going to get some pushback. And keeping in mind, we're also in a minority government still. So while this may gain support from, to not challenge it from a confidence level on when the budget is presented, nevertheless, there's going to be resistance to this. You have to figure.
Certainly, there's going to be resistance, and bureaucrats are famous for finding a way to slow walk anything if they believe that it can hopefully avoid the axe at the end of the day. And sure, there are going to be interdepartmental conflicts as one department or ministry tries to position itself as, oh no, you can't touch us, go after them instead. But that's typical in the budgeting process within cabinet governments. And that's partly why people like Sabia have been brought in, who aren't going to be swayed by the kind of interdepartmental rivalries that are characteristic of budgeting in modern governments.
Well, when you've got the unions already expressing, a big concern that they're going to see a sizable number of layoffs from this, I'm trying to think go forward here when, government contracts, union contracts come due and that kind of thing, because this could set the stage for a lot of labor disruption at the federal government level.
True, there's the possibility that depending upon how quickly they go at certain services they currently provide, there may very well trigger reactions in the workplace from the unions that represent government workers. But that may or may not emerge, and it may certainly I don't expect it will emerge at the outset. I think that I don't think their initial reaction is going to identify savings by announcing a series of large layoffs, for example. I think that may come. That will come. There will be some, no doubt. I'm not sure they'll be at the front end.
Well, I mean, look, let's face it, the unions weren't exactly happy about the whole back to work mandate, so they're probably going to be more vocal about this. But if you're talking about that much, billions of dollars, it's got to come from someplace. So I get that when you fire people, you're paying severance, and it does take longer to maybe work through. But is this just a situation where a lot of those programs that were in place in the later stages of the Trudeau government, do they just get axed right off the top, while at the same time keeping pharmacare and daycare and some of these other big ticket items that are kind of the third rail that they don't want to touch?
I think one of the things you'll see is that they're going to try to play more in their own sandbox. That is, have the federal government do things that the federal government is constitutionally tasked with doing. And to the extent that over the years there's been a growth, and there has been significant growth in areas that, if you like, cut into provincial areas of jurisdiction. There, I think you may see them take an approach that involves them, okay, we're done with this. This is a provincial responsibility. We've given you money. Thank you very much. But we are going to pull out of any program deliveries in those areas. That would not be a surprise. They did that in the 90s, as well, where the feds under Martin Chrétien had found that they had over the years expanded into areas of provincial jurisdiction. They were running programs side by side with the provinces in areas of provincial jurisdiction. And, they said, you know what? I don't think so. And they withdrew. And the provinces were then faced with either running the programs themselves if they really thought they were valuable, or the assets that were tied into them, or not. So I think you'll see that again.
Well, the other interesting thing that the finance department may run into here is the fact that our economy right now isn't doing all that great, according to the most recent statistics. And as we go through the year, there's been this talk about a recession and all this, which will hit revenues. So they've got that added challenge in the mix. And if you're talking about cutting, what is a pretty substantial part of the economy, the workforce in Ottawa and elsewhere within the federal jurisdiction, that is kind of a double whammy, is it not?
Oh, I think you're right. And I think the piece of this, which we know the least about, is what you've just touched on. The going forward performance of the Canadian economy. And we don't know, in large part, because of the discussions, negotiations with the Americans, and what impact those may have on our economy going forward. That's, I think, the one that, and what I suspect he's focusing on and trying to get a deal done by July. I think they understand they need to have some sense going forward of how the economy is likely to perform. And if they can put together some arrangements, deals, whatever you want to call them, with the Americans by this month, that will give them a degree of clarity that they really, really do need.
And so using the summertime basically just kind of figure all this out. I mean, it's been an interesting year, that's for sure, and we'll likely get some clarity as things get back to work after the summertime months in Ottawa. Listen, Professor, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, you're welcome.
That was Dr. Wayne Petrozzi, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Toronto Metropolitan University. Thanks for joining me today on the Big Story Podcast, special crossover edition with In This Economy. You can follow us on X at The Big Story, FPN. Leave your comments. My email is mike.eppel, that's E-P-P-E-L, at rci.rogers.com on social media. My handle is at Eppman, E-P-P-M-A-N. You can also listen to The Big Story, In This Economy, and other frequency podcasts like The Roz and Mocha Show on our Seeker app. That's S-E-E-K-R, or wherever you can find your favorite podcasts. My name is Mike Eppel. Again, thanks for listening.